Okay, so now we are moving on from the stand initiation stage to the stem exclusion stage, stage where some of the trees must go because there's not enough space. The last video spoke about stand initiation stage. Now we're moving on. So these trees now have grown in height, and here you can see that the letters are supposed to reflect the trees. So the whole idea is that the trees grow taller and taller. So here you can see this tree was outcompeted. A doesn't exist anymore, but there's lots of the B's, which are some of the ones that came up behind the faster growing intolerance. So the stem exclusion stage, what happens is, again, this famous thing about we talked about growing space. Trees try to reoccupy all available growing space when other trees die due to competition. And it's such an aggressive point that no new trees can start growing at this stage because it is such, and crown closure is so extensive, and there's no opportunities for smaller trees to come in. This is a picture I took in Ken Reed and their cedar areas, and you can see here this stand is now the point of stem exclusion, and there's very limited amount of others, virtually no other species growing. So all the trees are one cohort, as is pointed out here. So here we go with the tree spacing, and I will walk through this here so you can understand how this works. First of all, let's always, before you look at a graph, understand the axes. First, here, this axis is stand age. Okay, so from very young to old, just as all we need to know. And in this direction is tree spacing. It's widely spaced trees to narrow space. So if you plant your trees early and they're extremely closely planted, they all fit, they're fine, right? Or you can plant, trees will naturally come in and they're very widely spaced. They're all the same. Now the interesting part comes. Let's add some time. And the first thing is, if you take a very widely spaced stand of trees, and it could be in nature, what happens is over time, this is supposed to reflect the crown here. You can see that over time these trees have very minimal competition, and none of them die. But what can happen quite often, these trees usually have the largest branches because they're so open grown. Okay, and they continue on. And then here they're planted or they're naturally established a little closer, and as they come along you can see they're crowded a bit, still 1, 2, 3, 4 trees coming along. But what happens is, you can see here how the difference in crowns, because they're extremely close, they're a lot closer together. The bottom of the crowns, these trees have there's less crowns in these, so they're more susceptible to dying, or it may be desirable quality in trees such that we have less branchiness on trees. Now it gets interesting. Let's say you plant them even closer here. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trees. So very early in their lives, crown closure occurs. And see here, crown closure doesn't occur yet. but here it happens very early in life. And here the trees grow very close, and this is assuming that they all are like that cedar forest I just showed you, or red pine, and none of them want to refuse to die. And what happens is they reach, these trees here are the same age as these, but because excessive competition, height is actually influencing their growth. So this is, you can see how small the crowns are on these trees, and these are exactly the same age as these trees. And then the worst case scenario, and this, by the way, when you have this occurring, when you have height influenced by the competition, this is called stagnation. Stagnation. And this is an extreme example. This is a bit like ponderosa pine, Pinus contorta, and you can see here how stagnated they are. So tree growth is greatly influenced by the darn important thing called tree spacing. Another interesting graph is this one here. A lot of people think that in a forest that the more trees are, just you get endlessly more and more foliage on a tree. That is just not the case. If you take all the foliage in a stand, let's say per hectare, what you find generally speaking is that there's, let's say it was an open area and then the trees were initiated into the area, and then you would find that the foliage would dramatically increase, and then over time it levels out, and even like one big tree dies, a whole bunch of smaller ones would take its place, and then you would have, like, say 10 small trees worth of foliage represents one big tree that passed, that died. So it's generally, there's a constant amount of foliage in the forest. So it is a limiting factor for the amount of trees that can be placed on a site. Another trend over time, and you folks have shown that in your permanent growth plot data, is the whole idea of height, tree height, over time. And it's been shown that tree height rapidly increases early in individual trees or in stands, and then as the trees mature, the height slows down because it takes more and more energy for that tree to keep the whole thing going through, providing sufficient nutrients. And so the height growth, which is one of the lowest priorities for a tree, would be reduced over time, because the canopy, again in the last diagram, the canopy is limited based on space. Trends in stands. Another exciting trend in a forest stand is tree volume. So tree volume, okay, is directly related to crown size, and we use this a lot when we do aerial photography. We use this a lot to calculate how big a tree is. We look at the tree's crown, and then based on the tree's crown, we can establish that what is the tree's volume. So in other words, if the tree had a large crown, right, we would assume that it would have a large bowl, which would represent a fair bit of volume. Okay, so and that's a direct relationship. Well, compared to if it was a narrow little tree which was suppressed, it would have, because its the crown size is very narrow, right? So the crown size is the measurement across the crown. That's how we measure crown size. Okay. So crowded stands. So what happens in a stand And how, so knowing all the information we just discussed, what happens? Well, if you only have so much foliage available, and big trees can outcrowd smaller trees, and what happens is you start seeing trees fall down because they get too skinny, as was shown in the earlier diagram. In large winds, trees will start snapping or the snow will, weight of heavy wet snow will break the trees. Insects and disease outbreaks are more likely because the trees are so stressed out in competing for available nutrients, which are very limited. They are more available for attack by insect or disease. Fires, there's a crowded stands now have a fair bit of dead material in them and are more prone to fire. These stands, when they reach this point when they have stopped going to the growing in the stand initiation stage and are now at the stem exclusion stage, in other words, individual trees want more space and the competition begins, then you see all these things occur. Interesting thing to note is that broad-crowned trees have a difficult time in narrow situations. So in other words is, if you have a whole bunch of large, like hard maple trees, and you have another hard maple tree trying to grow underneath, and let's pretend that's a little hard maple tree, trying to find enough space to get through anywhere is far more difficult versus if it's a conifer. Okay, it can find a smaller space and come straight through the canopy. So sometimes you will see that these narrow conifers have a more opportunity to break through that canopy, but it is generally very difficult for trees in the understory, intermediate stage to become part of the canopy. It is generally not recognized until one of the big boys fall over. So if you just go back, beginning of stem exclusion happens when all these situations occur. Now, why, all the trees are growing, let's say all the seed theoretically landed at the very same time and all started growing. You would think that all the trees would be exactly the same height and they would be all in the same location, but as was discussed in the earlier lecture, is that there are differentiations in height because some trees had a slower start because the seed established itself maybe later in the stem initiation stage, could be 20 years later. Okay, and so when everything starts to grow, you have the first trees who took off and have established themselves become the dominant layer. So just roughly here in this example, you would say these are the dominant, and that anything else coming up in there would be the understory intermediate. So if and a lot of people think that because one of the big trees fall down, that one of the understory will always suddenly zoom out and take the growth. But what happens, quite honestly, and it's been proven over and over, is that if the space isn't great between the trees, when one of the trees fell down, what happens is that the foliage from the remaining trees rapidly grows inwards and they occupy that space, therefore again blocking out any attempt of the trees from underneath coming in between. So this crown closure occurrence we use this concept a lot when we do shelterwood harvesting. It's a technique to make sure that we can encourage the understory but also have larger mature trees on site. So the spacing factor here So spacing is a big deal, as I've just started talking about. And now this is called a single cohort. So we have all the trees coming. So again, start at the bottom of this diagram, and let's take a look what it does. And every tree has been numbered. So you can see this is tree B here, and tree C, and so on. So if we look at tree A and B as they grow, you can see if you look at A, B, C, as they grow taller. So here's A, B, okay, and C, and you can see here that because B had a bigger crown on one side, that it was able to get all the way up and becomes eventually actually part of it. Ends up with a bigger crown eventually on the C side. And you go, well, how is that possible when it virtually had no crown at all on the C side? And if you look, what it is that tree C is being competed aggressively. It has a tough time because on both sides of it, D is competing with C and B is competing with C. So as the trees grow, they're growing extremely close together, these two trees, C and D. So the amount of crown they have is very shallow. So they are now prone to one of them dying because their crown is well below a quarter. Their LCR is well below a quarter of the tree. And you can see here that C is starting to get squished out. Here it is suppressed. Okay? And then here, C, at this point in time, it becomes a Chico. Okay? We have a death in the forest. Right? So then there's it as a Chico. So if you follow through here, you can, and this is very typical, but that spacing has a huge impact on how trees survive. So you can see here you have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have from C to G way too closely established themselves, so the seed land is very close. And as they grew up, between C and G, okay, what we have left is we have only one good-sized tree, which is G. D and E, C is dead, D is suppressed, E is suppressed, F is dead, and G survived. So very competitive, but it gives you an idea, if you look through, follow through the years, what is the influence of spacing to a tree. And when trees die because of competition, we call that regular mortality. So it isn't like from a wind burst or insects and disease. Everybody always wants to say when a tree dies, oh, it's because of insects and disease. It's just a catch-all phrase. It's not the case. Most times when trees die, most of the time it's because of competition. Especially if you see trees of smaller diameters dying, which should be healthy because they're young and vibrant, it's because they've been squeezed out from the other trees as the competition occurred. And you folks noticed that in your permanent growth plot data when you illustrated that. So when does regular mortality occur? It happens for many reasons, and final evidence is disease in insect occurs because of competition. It is not the reason for the death of trees, insect disease, but because of the competition. So death can occur because variation in microsite. I love these little diagrams from the book Forest Stand Dynamics because they really give you a good idea how forests grow. So sometimes a fast-growing tree can die on a site where slower-growing trees exist. Who's your neighbor? Right? So this has a lot to do. So a lot of people think, oh, it's a faster-growing tree, it will survive. Well, that's only true if you got somebody slow growing beside you. So if you look at H here, you can see H is a slow growing tree. And then, so it's growing along. Now, G is a fast growing tree. So away they go. And you can see that eventually that G grows faster and H actually dies. Now that's not a big surprise, right? But then you go, well, all these are faster growing trees. Let's go back to the bottom of the diagrams. You look at, for example, D is a fast growing tree. Okay? D is a fast growing tree. So away they go, but for some reason, because of slightly different microsite, D, a fast growing tree, is left behind. It may be on a slightly little more moist site, and the other ones are growing on a little more mesic site, and so what happens is that D becomes a Chico over time because it's outcompeted, because its microsite was not as good as the microsites of its neighbors. So one of the questions a lot of times is, in a forest, over time, what kind of microsites can you find trees on? Well, what happens is, this is a little funky diagram, but let's work through it. What happens is, over time, okay, over the, let's say, 100 years, and as you have a microsite, and then the area is totally opened up, and the seed will land on all microsites generally. Okay, they will land on all microsites. And from poor to good, don't worry, there's a little bit of space here, but basically you see all the seed will land on poor to good. Now, as a tree, of all those thousands of trees start growing, the sites where you would find seedlings growing, first, when they're little tiny seedlings, you'll find them from the very poor to the very good microsites. But because the trees growing on the good microsites grow so much better, the trees found, let's say at age 15, you will find less trees on poor microsites because the ones that were on very poor microsites were outcompeted, so they're dead. And so progressively, as the years go on, what happens is more and more trees are outcompeted, and only the trees really on the best microsites eventually end up surviving on that particular location, because they have so much better ability to compete against ones that have landed on poor microsites. So near the end of the life, you can see that it's quite remarkable how narrow of a band of sites a certain all the trees will use on a site as the for competition reasons. So another question, a lot of people think that older trees will always dominate a site. That's just, I don't blame people thinking that. Why not? If you're an older tree, you've got to be the tree that's going to make it all the way. So here, let's take a look at this example, that concept, and see how true that is. So we got a stand. It's been all opened up, and you can see here through natural regen, these guys A, B, and C got a good start. So when G finally peaks out, it's now, let's say 20 years have gone by, and this guy finally is 2 years old, and these guys are about 18. You go, well, these guys are going to smoke the other guys because they're that much bigger. So B, you would think, would be guaranteed a good life. So B races up, and as you can see, B gets outcompeted because the other trees on either side literally squeeze it out, and it becomes a Chico. So this was a tree that had a 18 or 16 year head start from G. Meanwhile, G, which is well spaced, continues up, and because its competition is not as great, it continues up and becomes eventually part of the overstory. That would be a co-dominant tree versus a dominant tree. So these are dominant, and you can see they're all roughly in the same area, but these are co-dominant. Okay? So age does not mean, at an early age, does not mean a bigger tree at maturity. It's all to do with microsite and the spacing of trees. Now, this graph is a neat little one here, and it talks about how much variety do you see in, or variation do you see in stands based on site class. And remember, site class, or SC as you have seen it on the GIS, means height growth versus fertility. So when we look at these, as we go across here, the site class 1 is fantastic site class for trees, for tree growth, and gets progressively worse as you go across. Now, what they found was that on site class 1, because there's so much growth occurring, that the trees rapidly grow, crown closure occurs early, and the trees start losing their some of their branches, opening it up, and we see understory development occur faster. So in other words, what happens is that the better the site, the faster do we go through the stages of stand initiation, stem exclusion, and so on. So when you get to a very poor site, it just everything slows down as far as the variations in differentiation of the forest stand into different vertical structures. Okay, and this is just some little sidebars I wanted to add. This is emerging properties of developing stands. If you have some crazy thing like 50,000 trees per hectare, like you have in Pinus contorta after fire, it literally stagnates the growth of the forest. That's one of those oddball things. It rarely occurs. But what can happen quite often, you will see a forest which is, if you see and go, God, how's that going to work? You'll see the forest is all in clumps, and the trees are in groups here and there across an area. But over time, over 100 years, you will see the spacing between trees be rather even, because competition will govern that some of the trees will be removed, and the trees which are in clumps will have more stem exclusion than, of course, wide-spaced trees. One of the things you note is that waves of mortality is that it isn't like you get an equal amount of death in a forest during the stem exclusion stage, but it comes in waves. So for example, what could happen is you have the trees reach around 30-40 years old, especially red pine, cedar, balsam fir, and what happens is many trees die at one point in time, and you'll see a lot of small trees dying, and you'll notice that in some of the stands you walk through. The stand's not sick or something, it's going through the stem exclusion stage. Okay, so, and wow, this is not very profound. Skinny tall trees released are less apt to survive. A lot of times people think they can just release any tree and then hope that it will survive. But the relationship is that the larger the tree is, the longer the tree will live. Okay, so that's not very amazing, but so in other words, the wider the tree is spaced from other trees, the longer it will live, because there's less competition. So here is just a response to thinning, and when I say thinning, that could mean people, but it can also mean 90% of the time, actually 95%, it means in nature, natural thinning of the stand. It's nothing to do with a power saw or a brush saw. Okay, so if you have a stand and it's this spacing here, as you can see, and it grows, crown closure occurs, and then the trees are very close, you could allow it to keep on growing, and it would be tall, skinny trees like it was shown in the very first diagram like this, or let's say if we get involved to keep it, or stem exclusion occurs at this point in the forest, then the trees die off, the ones in between, and they would grow here into this type of stand, and you can see that the crowns, it would be a thinner tree with a higher crown. Or if more trees die off than expected, and you have only 3 here now, more spacing, crown closure takes longer to occur. Then you have fewer trees, but they have a deeper crown, larger diameter, which may be more desirable. But you can just see how the thinning of the stand can greatly influence where it ends up in the future. So, how fast do crowns close? And generally speaking, it's been proven that the younger the stand, okay, the faster the crown will close again. And why is that a good thing? It keeps out competition, right? So older trees, when you thin them out, they don't respond as fast. And a good site will certainly have faster crown closure than a poor site, because it just doesn't grow as fast. So a lot of times a question is the timing of things that can occur, and this can be quite interesting, is that when does it occur, does actual change in structure. So let's just walk through some examples here. The trees have established themselves, crown closure occurs. Then some of them die for some reason, okay, opening it up, and then right away the trees are now on this path, and then they continue up. Or that's very early. That'd be like if it was humans involved, this would be called a PCT, pre-commercial thinning. But typically what happens is if we do a commercial thinning, we allow the forest to get a little bit taller, so we get some products out of it, like pulpwood, small saw logs. We thin it here, and then the tree, we hope, and then they usually do, the trees respond, and they end up tracking here, and they go up. So you can get away with it surprisingly late, but the longer you wait, the more risk you have of having trees dying because of wind damage, buckling, ice storms, and such. So it's always a little bit of a gamble when you go from, how far do you go before you thin it. In Ontario, thinning can occur as early as, I've seen it at 18 years and as late as 55 years. But it's definitely a little bit of a gamble when you wait too long, because you can have a lot of damage in a stand. And this is, so that gives you an overview of the stem exclusion stage. It's probably one of the most dynamic stages of the forest. And it'll certainly give you an idea of why trees die at a very young age. Thank you.